Hello, my name is Ross Gelspan. I was a journalist, not an environmentalist. I didn't get into the climate issue because I love the trees. I tolerate the trees. I got into the issue because I learned the coal industry was paying a handful of scientists under the table to say nothing is happening to the climate. So the impulse that propelled me into this work has nothing to do with the love of nature. It came from a deeply held belief on which I based a 30-year career that in a democracy, we need honest information on which to base our decisions. And in this case, some very powerful interests were hijacking our reality. And I know in my bones and from all my experience, that bodes very badly for the democracy. It also turns out that it bodes very badly for the planet as well. Just a bit of background. As I said, I was an investigative reporter with no interest in writing about the environment. I'll give you two examples. At the height of the Cold War, I spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union interviewing dissidents, people in the underground. It was a very sobering trip. 3 years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Czechoslovakia, and several of the people I interviewed had recently returned from a couple of years in exile in labor camps in Siberia for peacefully protesting against that invasion. The people I interviewed all had their apartments bugged. During some interviews, we communicated with children's slates in which people would lift the top sheet to erase the writing underneath. In other cases, we passed notes back and forth, which they would burn in big brass ashtrays. In one case, my host pulled me into the bathroom and kept the toilet flushing to prevent our conversations from being overheard. At the time, the head of the main Soviet human rights group was a man named Andrei Sakharov. He was also the father of the Russian H-bomb. I was told by his associates he wanted to meet, but they vetoed the idea because either or both of us could be charged with passing nuclear secrets, so I met with other members of his group instead. They warned me from my very first interview not to try to take any notes out of the country. So every night I would transcribe that day's interviews, and then I'd copy over every previous interview. And I kept recopying my interviews for almost 3 weeks. The day before I left, I wrote all my notes down in my own handmade shorthand, and I dropped them into a street corner mailbox to a friend in New York. Lo and behold, when I went to the airport the next day, 2 KGB agents took me into a room where I was partially stripped, searched, and questioned for about 6 hours. I almost didn't make it out of the country. They threatened to detain me past midnight when my visa would expire, and one of my interrogators explained very clearly that would make me a political criminal. At the last minute, after I demanded to speak to the American embassy, they let me go, and I managed to grab the last flight out of Moscow. When I got back, I wrote 4 very long articles from memory. Before I handed them in to my editor, my notes arrived, and it was miraculous. I had remembered every word of every interview verbatim, except for one secondary interview, which I wasn't going to use anyway. It was a compliment to have a congressman read these articles into the congressional record, but that reporting experience yielded a much deeper revelation about the incredible reservoir of untapped mental capabilities we all share. It also sobered me to the brutal reality of life in a totalitarian state. About 15 years later, I fell into another series of stories that sucked up all the oxygen in my professional life. They involved serious abuses by a very small group within the FBI in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. At the time, Central America was a major political focus for liberal and leftist activists who opposed Reagan policies in Central America, specifically his support for the Contras, a right-wing group to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, and his opposition to leftist movements in El Salvador. This movement was different from a lot of previous political movements in that it involved a number of religious activists from church groups who were dismayed by the suppression of civil rights in Central America. They created a movement called the Sanctuary Movement to provide safe haven for Central American activists who were forced to flee to the US. One day, one of those churches, Old Cambridge Baptist Church, suffered a break-in in which nothing of value was stolen, only lists of members. It was worth about 3 paragraphs in the paper. But over the next 2 months, I got reports of similar break-ins and thefts of files from churches and activist groups all over the country. I think I had registered about 70 such break-ins in a couple of months. And no other reporters in those cities were looking at what was happening nationally, so they discarded them as insignificant. The break-ins, especially at the churches, had a very powerful effect. Most of these churchgoers were not veteran activists. They were moved to provide protection for persecuted Central Americans for moral reasons. And as the break-ins kept occurring, many of these sanctuary movements became intimidated, and they either left the movement or lowered their profiles and lowered their voices. Unbeknown to the public, a small group of FBI agents, headed by the assistant director of the Bureau, had contracted with the founder of the Salvadoran Death Squad. This was not general knowledge within the FBI, but only to this small group headed by the assistant director. Frank Borelli, the name of the Death Squad founder, brought 2 death squads into the US to harass and intimidate activist groups who opposed the administration's policies. I got close to Borelli when he was called to testify before the House Committee on Civil and Constitutional Rights. When Frank began his testimony, the Republican congressman held up a piece of paper and insisted Borelli be shut down because he had failed the lie detector test with the FBI. Basically, the hearing was over before it began. Still, for some reason, I really felt Borelli was telling the truth. So with his permission, we filed for his records under the Privacy Act. It's similar to the Freedom of Information Act, except it deals with personnel files. When we got his files, one set of documents declared that, lo and behold, he had passed his polygraph test with flying colors. The examiner found no deception. Borelli explained to me that his death squad partners had been breaking into churches and political activist offices, all of whom they regarded as communists. And they closed the circle by submitting those files to the FBI, who then put them into the Bureau's terrorism files. He also gave me a set of tape recordings between himself and the head of the National Guard in El Salvador. And the National Guard would forward to Borelli the names of Americans who had been down there so that when they returned, they could be subject to harassment, intimidation, and break-ins. For his part, Borelli forwarded to the National Guard the names of Salvadoran refugees who were being deported back to El Salvador, most of whom were disappeared when they landed in that country. I'm omitting some other cloak and dagger adventures, but in retrospect, the whole episode turned out to be the domestic side of the Iran-Contra affair. My own reporting on the scheme concluded with the front page story that led the Globe and a number of other papers around the country, and the headline was something like, FBI entered the names of 100,000 law-abiding citizens in its terrorism files. Subsequently, 6 FBI officials were disciplined, and the number 2 man at the Bureau who had overseen the operation was bounced down to a desk job in a local field office. Personally, the FBI story was very difficult. I received several death threats, my phone was tapped, my mail was opened and rewrapped in plastic, and my obsession caused far too much pain and anxiety for my wife and daughters. At one point, my 10-year-old daughter broke down crying and said, "Why does Dad love the FBI story more than me?" I had no answer. But it left me with a run of front-page stories in a book and a promise to my family never to put them through this kind of stress again. Of course, that was before I learned about global warming, but fortunately, we were all many years older by the time that one rolled around. I know I was asked here to talk about reporting and climate change, but I wanted you to have this background so you'd understand where I was coming from when I accidentally tumbled into the global climate crisis. In fact, it was a piece of investigative reporting that propelled me into climate change. In the early 90s, I was very close friends with a Harvard scientist who would later publish groundbreaking research on the impacts of climate change on human health. He was so passionate about the issue of global warming back then that despite his credentials, I felt I needed a more sober assessment. So I read the work of 3 climate skeptics. And they convinced me that there was no climate change problem. They contended the activists were using the issue to pursue an anti-corporate agenda and that global warming was basically a non-event. The skeptics were so persuasive that I was about to drop the subject, just drop it and move on to something else. But as a courtesy, I wanted to keep an appointment I'd made earlier with Dr. James McCarthy. McCarthy was a scientific giant. He later became head of Working Group 1 of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also chair of the American Academy for the Advancement of Scientists. When I asked McCarthy about whether climate change posed a truly serious threat, he said as slowly and clearly as possible, "If this unstable climate we are now beginning to see had begun 100 years ago, the planet would never be able to support its current population." That got my attention. I asked him why, if this problem was so big, why wasn't it being covered in a big way by the news media? McCarthy told me there was a small handful of discredited scientists who were getting lots of media attention and were either dramatically downplaying the threat of climate change or dismissing it outright. They were very successful in spreading the message that the science was unsettled, that it was far too uncertain to take any action on the problem. McCarthy added that he and his colleagues in the scientific community were mystified as to where these skeptics were getting their money. It certainly wasn't from any traditional agencies or foundations that fund scientific work. Not long afterwards, I learned that 4 of these skeptics would be appearing at a very obscure hearing at the Minnesota Department of Public Utilities. This was in the spring of '95. It turned out the DPU was holding hearings on increasing electricity rates to raise money to offset environmental damages from burning coal, air pollution, low-level ozone, the disposal of coal ash, and so forth. And one member of the state legislature instructed the DPU to consider climate change as well. So I decided to go to the hearing just to hear these skeptic scientists. Before the hearing, I had a discussion with the Assistant Attorney General who was going to conduct the hearings, and I asked if she would require the skeptics to reveal under oath where their money came from. And it turns out that these climate skeptics were being paid several $1 million from coal and oil companies. And since this was a very obscure hearing and I was the only reporter in the room, it got no news coverage. So I wrote a piece exposing the funding of these corrupt scientists, and the piece ended up as a cover article in the December issue of Harper's Magazine. And after the article ran, I sat back and said to myself, if there's this cover-up going on, what are they covering up? And that's when I began to learn as much as I could about the science and the impacts of climate change. I learned through interviews with a host of different scientists that unintentionally, we have set in motion massive systems of the planet with huge amounts of inertia that have kept this Earth hospitable to civilization for 10,000 years. We have heated the deep oceans. We have reversed the carbon cycle by 500,000 years. We have loosed a wave of violent weather. We have changed the timing of the seasons. We are living on an increasingly narrow margin of stability. I tried to communicate this through two books. The first one, The Heat is On, was excerpted in the Washington Post and some other papers, and it got a remarkable bump when then President Clinton pulled it up at a press conference and told the press he was reading it. The second book, Boiling Point, received the lead review in the Sunday New York Times Book Review, probably because it was fortunate enough to be reviewed by Al Gore. But the IPCC understated the urgency of the climate crisis because the governments of the world consistently toned down the scientific assessments so they wouldn't create any popular turmoil, any big political reactions. And the scientists, moreover, who predicted startling changes in ocean warming, glacier melting, the explosion of insect populations, forest die-offs, extreme weather events, they have themselves vastly underestimated the speed of change. The scientists have projected a number of dramatic changes in the next 50 to 75 years, and unfortunately, many are occurring far ahead of schedule. We are already seeing crop failures, water shortages, the very visible displacement of environmental refugees, and escalating damages from extreme weather events that will eventually threaten national budgets. Last year alone, the US suffered 20 individual billion-dollar loss events from warming-driven disasters. And unfortunately, the climate shocks to come are even more alarming. One of the biggest glaciers in Antarctica, the Thwaites Glacier, could fall into the sea within the next couple of years and raise sea levels by nearly 2 feet. Last year, Greenland lost enough ice in one day to cover the state of Florida with 2 inches of water. The drought in the western US is the worst in 1,200 years, and the North Pole is rapidly morphing into the North Pole. As a non-scientist reporter, I had to learn the workings of all manner of planetary systems and dynamics and feedbacks. And I must say, I'm not a religious person, but as a layperson, learning about the invisible interplay between our atmosphere and our oceans, the ever so delicate balance between the evolutions and extinctions of various forms of life, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the unfathomable complexity of interactions between systems, and the exquisite balance of planetary dynamics, I did undergo a succession of spiritual experiences, of breathtaking glimpses of the overwhelming and truly stunning mechanics of nature. And it gifted me with a profound appreciation of the miraculous world we inhabit that I never would have experienced without doing this work. And of course, as I chronicled the devastation of so many aspects of our ecosystems from global warming, I've experienced many moments of profound and indelible sadness. Working on this topic has left me with both a young man's sense of wonder and an old man's despair. As I noted at the beginning, I was a reporter. And in the face of my sadness over our collective human failure, my only response has been to look reality in the eye and write it down. Thanks so very much for your attention.